Well, Oregon's roster has gotten better this offseason, but is it enough to stand out from the rest of the pack? Not quite, but we're getting there. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe, rate, review, please and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show. We have hit our goal. How about that? Thank you all so much. We've hit 3,000 subs on the YouTube channel. I'm appreciative to all of you. We're talking about Oregon's roster today. Football talk? Actual, honest-to-goodness football talk in a time like this? Who could possibly do such a thing? Me. It's me. I could, because I'm the executive producer and host of this show. So I decide what goes into the show. Isn't that fun? Answer, yes, it is kind of fun. So talk about that defensive line and a couple interesting mailbag questions about the future. So let's start with Oregon's roster. Mailbag, by the way, YouTube comments, Twitter, at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks. DMs and mentions wide open. This is from Nathan. Hi, Spencer. He says hi. I said hi, A. I don't really know why. Hi, Spencer. Here's a question. We know who the top 5 are in the conference, but that doesn't mean they're all the same. Have the Ducks improved enough on defense to stand out in that group? Has DJU helped the Beavs enough? So I look at the Pac-12 going into 2023 and say, Oregon has one of the best rosters in the conference. Do they have the best roster? They could. They absolutely could. Doesn't mean they'll have the best season, by the way. Texas A&M had a better roster if you're talking about composite rankings, which is largely how we are evaluating these rosters. Not entirely, but largely. They had a better one than, say, Kentucky a year ago or Vanderbilt a season ago. Kentucky had a better record than Texas A&M. Vanderbilt had the same record. Now, you are not where your record says you are in college football, but my point is that having the most talent doesn't mean you are automatically going to win. I think Oregon had more talent than Oregon State last year. They did not win the football game. It is not entirely determinative of what's going to take place in the actual season. But is Oregon's roster among the best in the pack? Yes. And look, you could make an argument that they have the most well-rounded roster in the pack, but what is holding me back from saying they have the best roster in the Pac-12 right now is that there are some unproven commodities at really key positions. So, Oregon's offensive line, for instance, is undergoing a number of changes. There are talented players in there. There are even some experienced players in there. Jackson Powers-Johnson, probably going to be the center. Marcus Harper will probably see the field. Stephen Jones. Junior Angelau coming from Texas. A Johnny Cornelius from Rhode Island. These are all guys who have played college football and had levels of success that lead us to believe, yeah, okay, they should be a good offensive line unit this year. But do they all gel together perfectly the way that the offensive line did a year ago? My guess would be probably not, at least not at first. Hopefully by the end of the season, or really by the Washington game is when things really are going to have to be firing on all cylinders. But if I look at Oregon's roster and I compared it to Washington, for instance, I'd say quarterback, that's about a wash. Penix is maybe a touch more, consistent, making throws. He was asked to do more throwing the ball last year. Bo Nix has got a more dynamic running ability and brings that component to the offense. That's probably a wash. Oregon, you got more talented running backs with the Ducks. You probably have a better receiving corps, but Washington by just a little, but not by a lot. Tight ends, I'll lean Oregon. Offensive line, that's probably about a wash. Defensive line, I lean towards the Huskies. But then you can ask these sorts of questions when you're doing these direct comparisons. They have Zion Tupuola-Fatui and Braylon Trice. Those guys are studs. Mateo Uiagalelei could come in and be a stud as a true freshman. Maybe he's not ready. I don't really know. Jordan Birch has got the physical traits to be really, really good. But can I guarantee you right now he's going to be an all-conference player? I cannot. I can with Braylon Trice at Washington. What about the interior of the defensive line? Kind of up in the air. Linebackers, questions, defensive backs. I think Oregon's got more talent than Washington. Huskies have made a couple of changes or improvements or gotten guys back from injuries from what they had there a season ago. But I like Oregon's defense overall more than Washington's going into this season. But that's where I'm kind of getting at with this point is you can do that sort of comparison. I picked Washington as an example, but you could do it, frankly, with Utah and USC or even Oregon State. I think you'd probably come away saying Oregon has a more talented team than Oregon State. But with regards to USC, Oregon might have better individual units, but Bo Nix is not Caleb Williams. Bo Nix is very good, but Caleb Williams is the best player in college football, in my view. So all these sorts of factors line up to say that you can make a case that this team or that team has the best roster in the Pac-12. But to your question, has Oregon separated themselves yet? No. No, I don't think they have. But are they on the track to be doing so? I think that answer is yes. Because when I look at the other teams in the Pac, let's take out USC and UCLA. Let's remove them from the conversation since they're not going to be there going forward. And look at the other teams that Oregon's really competing with to have the best roster in the Pac. They're going to be first or second. They can't be any lower than third, and they're probably going to be first or second year in and year out. And the team that they're going to compete with most consistently is Washington, and then there's Utah. And Utah doesn't have as many big-time recruits. Utah can still have a lot of really, really good football players. But when I look at those teams, I think Oregon has the best chance to be balanced. I think Oregon has the best chance to have a high-level offense and a high-level defense. I'm not guaranteeing that that's happening, but they have the best opportunity to do so. Kyle Whittingham has been at Utah for like 18 years now. They're never going to be an elite offense per se. It's just not in their MO. Doesn't mean they can't be really good. We've seen them be really good. They've won the Pac 2 years in a row. They're capable of being very, very good. But would I ever consider them an offensive juggernaut? No. I would describe them as capable offensively and really good defensively. That's where they have always been. They are a great running team. They're a good enough passing team, but they don't have the sorts of, they have tight ends, but they don't have the receivers. Their running backs are good. Cam Rising is certainly a really good quarterback, but they don't have the sort of offense that you would see from Oregon or Washington or USC. It's just not their MO. And it doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean they can't win the Pac again. Of course they could. They're a contender in my view. They should be a contender in everybody else's view because they are. But when you look at what Oregon is capable of with Dan Lanning's defensive chops, and if they keep recruiting that side of the ball really well, and you look at what they're able to recruit on the offensive side of the ball as well, as long as they're able to get the quarterback right, Oregon can absolutely be a team that wins the Pac consecutive seasons or has a 3 titles in 4-year sort of span. I think that's absolutely possible. Again, assuming the Pac all stays together and such. So I think that is where Oregon sits, because I look at Washington and say they're just going to be an offensive team. They've got an offensive coach. They've got a really good offensive coordinator who eventually they'll lose to be a head coach, Ryan Grubb. He's really, really sharp. But that's where they're kind of set up right now and where they look to be. And I think Oregon's potential to have a great defense and a great offense is greater than anybody else's in the Pac. And I don't think they're there yet. We'll see what they have this year and how Dan Lanning's able to recruit, develop, evaluate talent, bring in guys from the portal who fit the scheme. So far, the portal, guys they brought in last year were mostly really, really good, really, really impactful. You think about guys like Christian Gonzalez. You think about Bo Nix, for instance, just to name a couple. So I think that's a good position for Oregon to be in and is something to continue to evaluate going forward. But right now, to answer your question, have they improved on defense enough to stand out? No, not in a significant way. Right? You could make the argument if you wanted to, and you would be reasonable. Reasonable people can disagree. But you could make the argument Oregon has the best roster in the Pac-12. You can do that. But is the gap is what matters. Because if you were, going to make your own personal ranking system, and you said Oregon was, a 9.3, nobody else, the next team wouldn't then be an 8 out of 10. The next team would probably be close to a 9. So I think this is something to continue to build towards. It's why you got to develop players, why you got to have talent, bring them in from the portal and all that sort of stuff we talk about. But I don't think that they stand out necessarily in that group. They're definitely in the upper echelon, no doubt about that. But they have not yet gotten to the point where they stand out in a significant way. One of the reasons they could do that in the future is the defensive line. some of whom we'll see in 2023. I'll be seeing if any of you go check out eBay Motors, because if you report back to me, I'll say, hey, great job, and also congratulations. Because for a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage, look for the green check to know if the part will fit, or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride eBay. Guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. ebaymotors.com. Let's ride eBay. Always effective, the second segment sip, at carrying along the show. So, continuing along here in the mailbag. Again, YouTube comments or Twitter at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks. Those be the ways to get in touch. This from Andrew. With the plethora of D-line signings, who do you see burning their red shirt this year? I have to imagine someone will stand out beyond Mateo and force their way into the rotation. So, great question. The defensive line in 2023, Brian Smith has talked about how ridiculous it is that they brought in 10 guys along the defensive line who are either edge players, guys like Tatum Tuioti or Blake Purchase, or 8 just straight up defensive linemen, right? Guys like Terrence Green, Johnny Bowens, Mari Washington, Ashton Porter. You can go down the list. So the question of burning the red shirt is not just playing, and this is a rule I, like most people, look at things the NCAA does and go, what are we doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Who told you to do this? What are you thinking while doing this? This is not one of them. That has been a recent change within the last several years or so. The NCAA allows you now to play in up to 4 games in a season without burning your red shirt. I think that's great for teams. I think that's great for players. And I think it's great for fans as well. Because that way they get to see kids who can be a part of the future. And it just raises the level of interest and intrigue with the program without them having to burn an entire year of eligibility. So I think that is a fantastic rule. I think it's great for teams because they can get kids experience and get an understanding of, in-game reps and live situations of where they could fit into the rotation now and in the future. And I think it's great for players because they get more exposure than they might otherwise get to live game situations. And if they do end up transferring somewhere else, they have a reasonable opportunity to be able to go to that coaching staff and say, hey, here's what I was able to do in the action that I saw over at this Power 5 institution or whatever school they happen to be coming from. So 10 defensive linemen in the class of 2023. I can't see, frankly, more than 3 of them burning a red shirt. I think you're going to have, because of the depth on the defensive line that Oregon has going into this season, I think you're going to see a good number of them not playing more than 4 games. Because you have on the defensive line, whether you're talking interior or on the edge or at the defensive end, right? Typically you have a hand in the ground defensive end, stand-up guy. It depends on the package that you're in and everything like that. But you have Jordan Birch, you have Brandon Dorlus, you have Casey Rogers, you have Mace Funa. Those are probably your starters. Then your second unit looks something like Popo Amavai on the interior, Taki Taimani. You have Mateo Uyunglele. You have maybe a guy like Blake Purchase could come in and burn his red shirt at the edge position, him or Tatum Tuioti, maybe one of the two. But then you keep going down the defensive line and you're like, oh wait, Keon Ware Hudson is in there. Oh wait, Jake Shipley, I believe, is still on the roster. I'm going to double check that real quick because he just popped into my head. So I think that there are just a lot of guys. Yeah, Shipley's still on the defensive line. He's like outside linebacker, edge kind of guy, special teamser, but still part of the depth chart in there. So you just have so many names, and a lot of the guys that Oregon recruited in the 2023 cycle are interior defensive linemen, right? Guys like Terrence Green, Johnny Bowens, Amari Washington. I think Ashton Porter's a guy who can go inside or outside, but those players are not going to have an easy time seeing the field this year unless Oregon gets a big lead. Now, Oregon should have a big lead to where they have an opportunity to see the field in. And by the way, I'm not even listing everybody who could play that's on the depth chart on the defensive line, right? Because you got to think about the 2022 class as well, and any guys that are there, any guys that have been on the roster for several years, right? Guys like Jake Shipley, for instance. So you have to look at all those factors and say, okay, Hawaii and Portland State, which are weeks 3 and 1, and I flipped for no reason in particular. Portland State and Hawaii, those are opportunities. Colorado could definitely be a blowout win. Stanford could be a blowout win, and Arizona State could be. That's 5 that could be. I'd be surprised if they all end up being that, to where those guys get to see a heavy run. I would say 4 is the absolute max. 3 is the most likely, where Oregon is going to have, a quarter or so of football where they have such a big lead that they're going to be able to put in the reserves on both sides of the ball and get them some experience there. So I think that the answer I'm going to stick with is probably no more than 3, because burning the red shirt would mean those guys would have to appear in 5 games this year. You would have to have, I think, just a litany of injuries along the defensive line, because you have Popo back, you have Dorless. Jordan Birch, by the way, could slide inside every now and then if he wants to. You have Casey Rogers, you have Taki Taimani, you have Keon Ware-Hudson there, you have Jake Shipley. You just have so many guys. It's hard to see any of those players needing to necessarily burn their red shirt. I would look at one of the edge positions, honestly. If one of, if Ashton Porter can play defensive end or edge, or if Blake Purchase, looks good. Max Torres has been really high on him for quite some time. Or if you look at Tatum Tuioti as well, if one of those guys ends up being a regular player, maybe they could play in more than 4 games, but it's kind of hard to see how it'd be more than 3 guys. I fully expect Mateo to be a guy that is 3 years with the Ducks and off to the NFL. That's what I would love for him to be. That's what he's capable of being. It's what he was recruited as. And frankly, I think that's what he will be. I think he's big-time stud, worth the 5-star recognition that he had and then lost, which only puts a chip on his shoulder, so I'm frankly good with it. So I think that that's how it kind of shakes out, is probably just 3 of them at the most. And heck, it could only be Mateo. There's a realistic world. When you factor in that you got Birch and Funa and, Dorless can go inside, outside. So then you could slide in a Popo Amavai and Casey Rogers and Taki Taimani and all these names, and the way they can mix and match with experience, depth, and talent. I could see no one other than Mateo playing in more than 4 games along the defensive line for the freshmen. Other freshmen could, but I could definitely see that being a reality. Great question, though. This from Alec. Good morning, Spencer. I have a question for Locked On Ducks. That be this program right here. What is the likelihood that Oregon doesn't land a 5-star prospect in the 2024 class? Thank you. Well, after missing Justin Williams and Elijah Rushing over the course of the month of July, I think it's hard to see us getting more than probably 2 5-stars. I mean, 3 would be just everything goes perfectly and wonderful, but I think we're probably looking at 1 to 2 in the 2024 cycle. The possibility that they land 0, it is higher than it was, because there aren't that many of these kids out there, and they're hard to get, and they're competitive battles, and you're going up against big-time schools that also have money, facilities, and cool tours, and live in awesome places, and play great schedules, and can get you to the NFL. Oregon's not alone in that sense. So I think it's a higher likelihood than before, but I still wouldn't say there's, a high probability that there are no 5-stars. I would be disappointed if Oregon ended up with 0 of Brandon Baker, of Williams Nwaneri, of David Stone. Not of David Stone, Aiden Breland. If they end up with 0 of those kids, given the length of time they've put into those recruiting battles, given the recruiting prowess that we have seen from Dan Lanning and his staff over the time that he's been here in Eugene, I would say it would be a disappointment. It would be a setback, but it would not be a disaster per se if they don't land a single 5-star in the class. Remember, Oregon's highest rated recruiting class of all time did not have a single 5-star player in it. So you can find great players that don't have 5 stars next to their name. But that said, Talk about those guys for an obvious reason. The guys that do have them, more often than not 100% of the time, they become big-time players. Like we have had, take Brandon Dorlus for instance. He is going to be an NFL draft pick. He is a really good college football player. I am so stoked that he's back on Oregon's defensive line this year. It bolsters it tremendously. He was a 3-star recruit. His career has played out like a 3-star recruit. He came to Oregon and he was playing, and he's solid, good rotation player. Then his role got bigger, and then he really popped last year. And now he's preseason all-conference first team on the defensive line. That's what 3-star recruits typically look like. Yeah, they have the potential, but they need a little bit more refinement. They don't pop right away. Heck, even Mariota and Herbert, by the way, who are the best examples at a different position, of course, but of 3-star guys becoming 5-star players, neither of those two guys popped right away either. Mariota sat out his first season. Justin Herbert as a freshman was not as good of a football player and quarterback as he was as a senior. Definitely not. So the 5-star guys get talked about because they have the greatest propensity in most cases, though there are exceptions, to not just become NFL players and NFL caliber players, which you need to litter your defense with to perform at a high level, but they have the greatest propensity to come in and contribute right away, immediately. Brandon Dorlus, 3-star guy, didn't contribute as much right away, contributing big time by the end of his career. That's what a traditional, quote unquote 3-star player does, or a quote unquote traditional 3-star player does, is the way that you kind of say that colloquially. But Kayvon Thibodeau, on the other hand, Pac-12 all-freshman, 2020 Pac-12 championship game defensive MVP, number 5 overall pick in the draft of the Giants. That's the way that those guys are capable of going. And you see a 5-star go along that trajectory, or a highly rated 4-star like Penei Sewell, or a guy like Troy Franklin, for instance, you see that career path a lot more often than you see a 3-star come on campus and start tearing it up immediately in year one. And if you go look at Oregon's 5-stars, the guys they've had commit over the years, more than half of them, well over half, not 100%, nobody's perfect, you can't ever be perfect, but more than half of them are guys that have had outstanding careers. And there have been guys who have had outstanding careers that weren't 5-stars. But the select few that did have the 5-stars, you have the Kayvon Thibodeaus, the Haloti Ngadas, yes, the Justin Flows of the world as well. But you also had Jonathan Stewart. You also had DeAnthony Thomas. Josh Connerly looks like he's going to be really, really good. So that's kind of the difference. That's why we talk about him. That was a little bit of a tangent, but you know what? You got me thinking. And your question, what's the likelihood Oregon doesn't land a 5-star prospect? I'd say it would have been 5 to 10% before we missed out on those two guys. Now I'd say it's 20, 25% or so. I still feel like they're going to get one of Baker, Nwaneri, or Breland. I would love for them to get 2, but I still feel like they're going to be able to land one of them. I'd say 75% right now. That is a lower confidence interval than I had previously. All right, last question to wrap up today's show. Oregon XYZ asks, here's a non-football question. I love these fun questions to answer the show. Always send them in. Here's a non-football question. It's like a good tension release, you know? Get all serious talking about this stuff. Just breathe a little bit. Here's a non-football question. A little kid came up with this one on my school bus. Would you rather run into a zombie or a vampire? Easy answer. Vampire. If zombies were to actually exist, there is no known surefire way to get rid of a zombie. If the zombie's already been killed, how can you kill a zombie? It's one of the, scientific flaws with The Walking Dead. If the brain is dead and the zombie exists, then how can you actually kill the zombie, right? A vampire, on the other hand, we are very clear on what to do. You take a clove of garlic, you put it anywhere near him, and you're good to go. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.